To understand where you are, you have to know where you've been. In 1984, to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the Heartland Series began. Today, 17 years and 1,000 adventures later, we're going back to our beginnings to revisit the nation's most visited national park. I'm Bill Landry with a look back on Heartland Tonight.
It's the best of the Heartland Series with Bill Landry on Heartland Tonight.
Tennessee is calling, rolling hills all dressed in green. Hear the Heartland calling, like an Appalachian spring. Smoky Mountain night is falling, the Heartland's calling me, calling me.
In celebration of a people and their land, that was our theme, still is. We were like children learning to walk when we started. We didn't know how daunting and awesome our subject was. We didn't know enough about the Great Smoky Mountains to know. On Heartland Tonight, we'll take a look back at the formation of the Great Smokies 300 million years ago and explore the coves with our classic Heartland guide, scholar and friend, Stuart Mayer, and journey to the heart of the temperate rainforest with Dr. Elgin Kittner. Early on, we learned that the mountains are made of sandstone and the coves are mostly limestone. So we asked ourselves the question, how did beach sand end up 6,000 feet in the air? The answer is still amazing. From Newfound Gap, you can see much of the Great Smokies. But the mountains we see today haven't always been here. In fact, once another mountain range, thousands of feet higher and millions of years older, were here. What happened to them and how the Smokies got here is a fantastic story. And it's a story we see every time we come to the mountains, if we only knew what to look for. Next time you go to the mountains, look at the rocks. Really look at them. Sandstones, conglomerates, and slates. Do you ever wonder how beach sand could end up 6,000 feet in the air in a great mountain like LeConte in the middle of America? The sand in these rocks looks as if it might be from the coast, as if it might have come out of some ocean. It did. Long before the Smokies were formed, the Earth as we now know it did not exist. The land masses were in a state of violent change. Much of the Earth was covered with ocean. Where the Smokies are now stood an ancestral mountain range, perhaps twice as high, forming the eastern coast of America. But in this steaming, violent world, they could not stand forever. They are attacked by the forces of nature, erosion. The atmosphere begins to corrode them. Ice freezes and cracks them, and the rains come. Knobs, hills, and mountains are torn away. In time, the rocks that formed them were underwater.
Here we're looking at a rock type we call conglomerate. That is rock composed of coarse-sized fragments of pre-existing rocks. These pebbles, quartz and feldspar, pieces of slate, represent the trash and the erosional products from a mountain range that is much, much older than the present-day Smokies. If you will, these are the ancestors of the Smokies. These are a very ancient, 800 million year, 1,000 million year old mountain range that was eroded, converted into sediments and carried away by the streams and deposited in the sea. But then, a gigantic force with the strength of more than 1,000 nuclear bombs tore this land from its roots and pushed it here. Pushed this land, building mountains in its wake. What could have caused this? What natural power is the strength of two worlds colliding?
About 300 million years ago, the Appalachian Mountains, as we now know them, were formed. What happened? These mountains were pushed up when the continents of Africa and Europe crashed into North America. Earthquakes accompanied it, but it happened. It took over 50 million years of pushing and shoving of one landmass against another.
This cut nicely exemplifies the forces that folded and bent these rocks some 350 million years ago. You can see how they've been cast into folds by compression operating from the southeast when Africa collided with the North American continent.
All of this was once sediment at the bottom of the ocean. It was crushed between two continents, wrecked, heaved high in the air, folded and thrown up as a mountain range, one of the greatest in the world, the Appalachians. That is how a rock that is once ocean sand gets 6,000 feet in the air.
Even though young Bill there was 30 pounds lighter and had black hair, that's a good show. The crashing of the continents perhaps wasn't our greatest achievement, but at the time a good effort. How the mountains were formed is an unbelievable story. In fact, after that show aired, we got a letter from a lady wanting to know which one of our employees was around 350 million years ago. Now that's science in action. We'll be right back. Former state geologist and Kenwell consultant Stuart Mayer taught us his sermons in stone. The idea that the earth is a great teacher if you know how to interpret it.
On a hot summer's day, there's nothing quite as cool as a creek in the Smoky Mountains. But the water that softly ripples is very busy at work. This creek and the creeks before it and the rains that filled them are the greatest landscapers of all times. They are the forces of erosion. The forces of erosion began sculpting these mountains 250 million years before the Rockies were formed. Geologist Stuart Mayer is our guide on a journey to an ancient past.
Bill, here we're standing at the edge of Tuckaleechee Cove. We see the high mountains around us. The cove is in the flat ground under our feet. We're walking up on some mountain rocks. I'd like to call your attention to how folded, deformed, and polished this surface we're walking on is.
Polished like they was grinded?
These are the place where the rocks actually moved in these mountain building faults we were talking about. And you can see here how the rocks were polished as they slid and scoured across one another, how they were deformed and bent. We're walking on the upside of the fault, what the geologist calls the hanging wall, because it's up over our heads. In the foreground now in front of us, we see the flat ground of Tuckaleechee Cove, composed of limestones, much softer, more readily eroded. At one time, the mountain rocks were over our heads. The erosion then bored a hole
In the mountain rock
overriding and made the cove. So we're standing looking at what we call a window through the Great Smoky Mountain Overthrust Fault. Nature has bored a hole for us. Let's go down here in the pit and I'll show you what we're talking about. Now this excavation we're standing is artificial. This was made to borrow material for fields for the highway and dug out. But it affords us an opportunity to see the evidence I'd like to present to you of the Smoky Mountain Fault. Here I have a piece of limestone. We imagine that the limestone is here like this. This piece of paper now represents these old mountain rocks being shoved by Africa colliding. It rose up and over the limestone. So the original older rock is now on top of younger material. And my finger represents erosion. It bores a hole in that overriding fault block. So I see the limestone through the hole bored by erosion. It may well have been a great series of sinkholes originally originated. Collapse continues and continues until we have the limestone continuously exposed to make the cove.
Weir's Cove,
Cades Cove, Tuckaleechee, any of the coves here in the Appalachians.
Cades Cove, the geological window into the roots of the Great Smoky Mountains. For all the great and mighty forces that has taken to push these mountains up millions of years ago, it is the gentle, persistent erosion of rains and streams like this one that has carved the subtle curves of green that we see today.
Stuart was the first of many of our teachers, and we miss him. He taught us something of the responsibility that came with our task. We too are stewards, as well as teachers of such a diverse subject, the mountains, people, plants, and animals of the temperate rainforest, one of the richest, most diverse habitats in the world, teeming with life, right here in our own backyard, the Great Smoky Mountains. It's ours to care for, our responsibility to save and protect. We'll explore that refuge in the rainforest when Heartland Tonight returns. There are more than 2,400 different species of plants in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and more kinds of trees than in all of Europe. We've never forgotten that fact. We first learned it here. The Great Smoky Mountains are a haven for nature lovers and botanists. They are a natural hothouse of plant life. There are more kinds of trees here than in all of Europe, more species of plants than anywhere else in the continental United States.
Why? Why are Canadian species like the northern spruce and the balsams and the firs found here? And why are coastal silver bells on the slopes of LeConte and other deep south species? The overwhelming triumph of life in the Great Smoky Mountains is the story of being in the right place at the right time.
What you see is an oasis of plant life. Many of the species found in these mountains have been here for eons. The Smokies are a true refuge for plant life. In fact, many of the plants found north of here came from these southern Appalachians. This mountain habitat helped save entire species from extinction during the extreme temperature changes of the Ice Age. While icy winds raged over frozen tundra north of here, northern species of trees and plants migrated to a friendlier climate along the north-south corridor of the Appalachians. They hung on with stubborn determination to the slopes of the Smokies.
We've had numerous species to persist within the Appalachians and to migrate during times of climatic stress. This contrasts with Europe, where the major mountain trends run east-west and formed a barrier to migration, so that many species became extinct in southern Europe at the end of the Ice Age.
Finally, the ice cap started to recede and the northern species began their migration north.
Earth continued to warm. The ice began to melt and coastal plains flooded as the oceans of the world rose 300 feet. Again, the southern Appalachians were a refuge.
With climatic warming, and particularly after 10,000 years ago, many species of southern plants migrated northward from the coastal plain, from along the Gulf of Mexico. There's a unique habitat within Cades Cove in the Great Smoky Mountains, where today we have a swamp forest of sweet gum and black gum and southern maple. And there are many other species within that swamp forest that also migrated in during this time of warmth and moisture.
But how could they both survive here, within the same area at the same time? What's so special about these mountains that they can support such varied forms of life?
Because of the variety of habitats, different environments. The elevations in the Great Smoky Mountains range from 900 to over 6,500 feet, with eastern, western, and southern facing slopes and all directions in between. There is sunshine, shade, and moisture. Nearly 90 inches per year in some places. It's a virtual greenhouse of plant life.
This is a temperate rainforest, one of only a few in the world. Today, with the protection of the National Park Service, the Great Smoky Mountains continue to be a haven for more than 2,400 different species of plants.
From a very special place in Cades Cove, Black Gum Swamp, we head up to the higher elevations where we find remnants today of what were once the crown jewels of the Smokies.
The red spruce and the Fraser fir are the crown jewels of the Smokies. This is where they're found, at the highest elevations where they face nature at its harshest. For eons they have survived here in this rugged environment, but today they are in danger, seriously threatened by an enemy against which they have no defense.
The fact that the red spruce and the Fraser fir exist at all in the Smokies is a pure gift of nature. They are indeed a Canadian zone species, saved from the ravages of the Ice Age by the warmth of the southern Appalachians. But now the forces of nature and the workings of man threaten to take them from the slopes of the Great Smoky Mountains. This is the majestic red spruce. Here we can see the growth rings. This tree is probably 120 years old or so, but in the growth rings, if we look carefully, we can see that at about 1960, the growth rate deteriorated rapidly in the last 20 years.
Over my shoulder, we have silhouetted on the white clouds bands of visible air pollution. This is primarily nitrous oxides, compounds produced by automobiles. We haven't documented mortality or death from air pollution yet. We do have documentation of reduced growth. The trees are growing at a much slower rate, and a thinning of the crowns where the needles are falling off prematurely, and then also a phenomena that we call dieback, where the trees die from the top down. In the Northeast, on the high elevation peaks in an ecosystem very similar to this in the Smokies, there is 90% mortality. We might just be seeing the initial symptoms of this massive dieback in the spruce fir forests.
Like the red spruce, the Fraser fir is also in danger. It is being attacked by this insect, the woolly aphid.
Bill, I believe we can find some balsam woolly aphids on this tree. This is a fairly young Fraser fir, but it's just developed the bark characteristics that are provide good feeding sites for this insect. In the process of feeding, substances are secreted by the insect that diffuse on into the wood, and that kills the tree. Here we have some that have been dead for quite a while and become covered with lichens. We tend to refer to these as ghost trees and create a ghost forest effect.
To combat the woolly aphid, periodic spraying of the Fraser fir is done with a biodegradable insecticide, but only so much of the forest is reachable. It can only be a small victory. The battle to save this species is much more in doubt. The American chestnut. Once this species was abundant here. Nearly the entire species was wiped out by the chestnut blight of the 30s. This is one of only a handful left today in the entire park. On top of these mountains, the red spruce and the Fraser fir are fighting for their very survival. Hopefully, our children will get to see those trees. Today, sadly, 90% of the adult trees are dead. We're recording highest levels of acid deposits in North America. In the last 3 years, there have been 128 days where it's unsafe to breathe the air in the Great Smokies. It's increasing 2 to 3 days a year. It's a mandated air pollution advisory system begun in 1996 to warn us of what's called bad air days. Summer visibility today is 15 miles when it should be 60. Annually, it's 25 when it should be 100. 30 species of plants are showing damage caused by air pollution. Overall pollution is twice as high as our worst polluted cities. We were warned of our serious problem 16 years ago. Hopefully, the Clean Air Act and other efforts like the Cades Cove Restoration Transportation Plan will help this air pollution problem that is affecting us all. We'll return after this. Rain, rain, Smoky Mountains is thy name. For weeks we waited for the rains to quit to go to Andrews Bald. Finally, we realized it wasn't going to quit raining. That's what it does in a temperate rainforest. It rains. The bluish mist rises, a symbol of the Great Smoky Mountains. Under this wet canopy, moderate temperatures and frequent rains create a haven for nearly 2,400 species of plants. Now, continual rains spawn a lushness startling even in this temperate rainforest. As threatening clouds swirl overhead, we join retired pathologist Dr. Elgin Kittner on a trip to Andrews Bald. The rhododendron and flame azalea are in bloom, their colors cut through the dense fog.
We've had a good year this year of rain and a lot of drought, so I guess it's built up a great deal of energy for blooming.
18th century naturalist William Bartram was so moved by his first glimpse of the brilliant flame azalea, he called it Fire on the Mountain.
This is the purple rhododendron, or the catawba type rhododendron. And when you look at these coming in the fall,
It's busy here in the rainforest. To the ruby-throated hummingbird, the azaleas are irresistible.
all around these bushes here and see variety.
Such extreme moisture gives rise to all sorts of unusual growth, like this fungus called dead man's skin, and the sundew, a plant that feeds on unsuspecting insects. Female junco acts distressed by our presence, but her nest is tucked dry and safe into the hillside. In a temperate rainforest, nearly 90 inches of rain can fall in the high elevations. It's likely there will be more than that this year. The rainforest is teeming with life at its fullest. We tried to take you back tonight to the beginnings and relive a part of this wonderful journey. What we didn't cover was our responsibility to the stories and to the people, but also our responsibility to the land and the park as stewards of the Great Smoky Mountains that we all are. See you next week on Heartland Tonight.